Right. So the topic that I'm going to be presenting today is redlining, which was a discriminatory practice with long-term ramifications. So you may ask, what was redlining? So redlining was a real estate development and neighborhood planning practice that was based on discrimination. It isolated and segregated racial minorities and the poor from opportunity. And it was one of many different tactics that were used that were very discriminatory tactics that kept those that were, like racial and ethnic minorities and those that were financially not well off, kept them from opportunity. So here you can see this diagram. There was different things like zoning and land use practices. There was urban renewal, public housing, and federal highway policies, and explicit racial discrimination and intimidation practices. But for this lecture, we are going to concentrate on this particular practice of redlining. So the history of discrimination in housing development goes back about 100 years when the National Association of Real Estate Boards was formed that was comprised of real estate associations. And these members were forbidden to promote, quote, race mixing in residential neighborhoods. And by the 1920s, segregation in residential neighborhoods was a top priorities of community builders, real estate agents, mortgage brokers, and mortgage underwriters. So in terms of practices that promoted racial segregation, you had zoning practices that excluded racial and ethnic minorities from living in certain areas and caused them to live in less desirable areas, like pictured on the slide, where there might be, harmful waste in the environment. And there was detrimental land use concentrated in communities of color. There was also racially restrictive covenants where there were contracts between property owners and buyers that explicitly stated what races were allowed to own that particular property. And then there was redlining. So redlining was a federally sanctioned discriminatory practice that existed from the 1930s through the 1970s. So really, it wasn't even that long ago that this practice still was in existence. The Federal Housing Agency had urban development policies that were informed by the belief that neighborhoods had natural cycles of growth and decline. And unfortunately, they had this very biased, racist thought that, neighborhoods started out, they had prosperity, they grew, and then they felt like if certain racial and or ethnic minorities were allowed to live in such neighborhoods, they thought that was a signal that there was impending financial decline of that neighborhood. And these ideas, these very, racist ideas influenced the property appraisal, lending, and underwriting process in real estate for decades. So something called the Homeowner Loan Corporation in 1935 was tasked with creating these residential security maps, they called them. So that's really what redlining is, are these maps that I will show you. And they did this in 239 cities throughout the US to determine the level of risk and, quote, risk in real estate investments. So local real estate agents and mortgage brokers were tasked with giving the federal agency, the Homeowner Loan Corporation, more local data on what they thought were more desirable areas. So this is an example of a redlining map, and this is Akron. So redlining is actually, what it shows is you can see the green areas are what they call A or first grade most desirable areas. And blue is slightly less desirable, but still gets grade B. C is less desirable, that's yellow, and then D is the red, which is the least desirable, which hence the term redlining. So in these, and depending on the color and grade that they were given, that's how much mortgage loans were backed by banks. So if you were a green area and you were, a homeowner wanting to get a mortgage in a green area, the loan had a lot more backing than if you're trying to get a loan in the red area. So you can see, you might say, well, what makes something a red versus a green. So this is actually taken from actual historical documents that you can find online, actually. And at the end, with the references, you can look to see where you can view these yourself, really. This is North Akron, and this was the least desirable grade D, and they're saying, that the class and operation of people that are living in this are laborers, and 50% of those folks were Italians and others, and they say, heavy settlement of, quote, colored Italians and other nationalities. So you can see this is what they were basing the quote undesirable status on. So as you can see, a very, very discriminatory racist practice here. So then if you look at the green area, which is, a more quote desirable area, they describe the folks living there as being, executives and professional, and you can see the percentage of foreign families, the percentage of non-white families as 0. So essentially this is all white, wealthy folks living in this area. So you may say, this is a pretty horrifying practice that this was happening in our communities. And you may say, well, thank goodness that, those days are over. But the long-term ramifications are really felt. So you can see this is actually life expectancy in Summit County from 2007 to 2016. And you can see, so there's Copley, Bath, Fair Lawn, which is, same area where that Fair Lawn Heights that was in green was. The life expectancy there is 81.3. And then if you look at North Akron, which is that area that we showed you that was red, the life expectancy there is much less at 74.7. So part of the reason this is such a big deal is that, those discriminatory practices really kept those racial and ethnic minorities from realizing opportunity. It kept them, in poverty, and kept them from owning land. And then in the end, really those folks are the ones that are experiencing poor health consequences in real time today in currently. So if you look at life expectancy by race, you can see in terms of, those are white folks of the top line, it's 78.3 is life expectancy for a white person living in Summit County. You can see for a Black person living in Summit County, the life expectancy is much lower. Again, not just with life expectancy, but with other health outcomes. Infant mortality rates are another marker for how healthy a population is. And this is actually Cuyahoga County, but you can see on the left, that's a redlining map of Cuyahoga County from the 30s, similar to, the one we showed of Akron. And you can see that in the areas where it's red, they're slightly larger. So the larger white circles are areas where there's higher rates of infant mortality. And you can see that in the yellow and some of the red, there's much higher rates of infant mortality than in those areas that were green back in the 30s. And I think the figure 21 there really shows that. I think it's a pretty, it's very telling in that you can see that the infant mortality rate in purple is much, much higher in those places that were rated yellow or red in the 30s as compared to infant mortality rates in those that were rated A or B, so green or blue. And then in blue, you see the neonatal mortality rate, and then the postnatal neonatal mortality rate in orange. So this just overall shows that, health outcomes in those people that are living in the areas that were historically redlined are much worse than those that lived in the areas that weren't redlined. So in conclusion, redlining was a practice that occurred from the 1930s up until relatively recently, the 1970s, and it has had a persistent impact on the livelihood, the health of marginalized populations. And it demonstrates that, the policies we make today can have long-lasting implications for ethnic and racial minorities, and that our current laws and policies must be informed by the knowledge of these past policies, so that resources can be distributed more equitably going forward to those folks that have historically been deprived of opportunity. And those are the references here.